This film was created in 2020 as part of the project Chronology Networks Society, generously funded by the German Research Foundation. It shows one possible reconstruction of what happened at Riedling in Bavaria. At some point, around 4300 BC, a large enclosure with a ditch and bank was built at Riedling. This period is called the Neolithic or Younger Stone Age. In Bavaria, archaeologists refer to this part of the Neolithic as the München culture. It is defined mainly through its elaborate pottery. At this time, many enclosures were built in Central Europe. But what were they for? The earthworks at Riedling enclose an impressive 16,500 square metres, and the ditches were at least 1.5 metres deep. Still, this enclosure was probably not built for defence. It was not constructed at the highest point of the hill, but on its soft southern slope. In addition, the ditch had many gaps, so-called causeways. All these would have been weak points for the defence. The site lay in a forested environment with large trees, and was surrounded by fields. It was not possible to see far from the enclosure. Only from the hilltop could people look northwards into the fertile plains of Lower Bavaria. The ditch was not regularly cleaned out. In it, archaeologists have found masses of broken things. Tools made from stone and bone, food remains, and especially lots of broken pottery. The pottery of the München culture was very elaborate and nicely made. There are many different shapes, such as bowls, cups, spoons, beakers, and many more. Several of these shapes take their inspiration from East and Central Europe, so people must have had far-reaching contacts. The nicest pieces have thin walls and elaborate decorations. It took a lot of time and know-how to make them. Sometimes this pottery was not simply thrown away when it broke, but deposited with other finds in big spreads of material. And sometimes archaeologists found human skeletons, or parts of them, under and inside these spreads. So what happened? Probably these are the remains of burial rites or other kinds of rituals. Let's look, for example, at feature 26. Here, an adult person lay at the bottom of the ditch, surrounded by animal bone, stone tools, and lots of pottery. More than 1,700 sherds. Why had all this nice tableware been smashed? Perhaps people wanted to show how rich their community was to afford such a feast, or perhaps pottery that had been used for a ritual was no longer fit for everyday life. Certainly the site of Riedling stands out because it has many more such deposits than other contemporary sites in Bavaria. A lot of celebrations went on there, and so the enclosure was probably a meeting place. Chemical analyses have shown that some of the people buried here had travelled to the site from elsewhere, perhaps the mountains of the Bavarian forest on the other side of the Danube River. But who were the people and lived and partied here? Overall, the remains of only 40 people were excavated at Riedling, men, women and children. This means that most of the people who lived here over the centuries were not buried in the enclosure. In Bavaria as a whole, burials are rare at this time. Only some people were chosen. For example, in pit 703, archaeologists found the remains of a young woman, aged between 17 and 30. Near her were large parts of several vessels, for example a small beaker and a bowl on a tall stand. The woman was gravely ill when she died. Her problems most likely began with an infection in the jaw. This spread and eventually reached the lungs and the brain. Without modern medical care, such diseases were fatal. In addition, the woman was probably pregnant when she fell ill. The remains of a newborn child were deposited near her. Without DNA analysis, we can't absolutely prove that this was a mother and her child, but it seems likely that giving birth was simply too much for an already gravely ill woman. These two individuals may thus have been chosen because of the particularly poignant circumstances of their death. Apart from feasts and burials, how did people at Riedling live? In the Neolithic, people were farmers and grew cereals. They also had domesticated animals, such as cattle and pigs, but sometimes they fished or hunted. For the time of the München culture, we know very little about what houses looked like. Burnt daub from the walls shows that people did build dwellings here, but wood was not preserved. The examples shown here are thus inspired by better preserved finds of houses from lake villages, for example around Lake Constance. These are roughly of the same age as Riedling. Inside the houses, people used more pottery, such as large storage vessels, which are more roughly made, cooking pots, and the smaller and nicer serving vessels. Around the houses were rubbish pits. Here, dogs and pigs could root around to their heart's content, and archaeologists could later be happy about the many finds. After about 100 years of use, no new spreads of material were deposited at Riedling. A second enclosure was built, but it has very few finds. In general, there were fewer pits and less rubbish. It seems that the community was shrinking. So what had happened? This is difficult to answer. There are no signs of major catastrophe, for example an attack. Perhaps Riedling simply lost its importance as a meeting place. In societies where a lot of wealth is invested in community feasts and rituals, power structures are often unstable and change quickly. By 3900 BC, at the very latest, the site had been abandoned. It took 700 years before a new settlement was built here. Archaeologists call this phase the camp culture. By now, animal herding was more important than before. Communities may have become smaller and more mobile. Only a few huts were built at Riedling. The pottery still shows signs of contact with other areas, and again there are many drinking vessels, for example finely made cups. Whether these contain just milk, or maybe also beer, is not definitely clear. Around 2700 BC, this settlement too had come to an end. In Bavaria, like elsewhere in Central Europe, this was the dawn of a new age, with new groups of people.